Hi, and welcome to another episode of Cooperant Learning. I'm Kyle Steury. Our guest today, we're really excited. He's a PhD in behavior analysis from the University of Florida, where he focused on basic choice processes, the role of verbal behavior in choice, and applications in clinical and ethical decision making. He completed a postdoc at Johns Hopkins in behavioral pharmacology and another postdoc at Insight Data Science, where he studied data science. He teaches the PhD program at Endicott College with a research lab focusing on big data analytics, AI, and clinical decision making. Welcome, Dr. David Cox.
Oh, hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here and chat with you about, I think, a really fun topic today.
Awesome. We are super stoked to have you. You've authored a brief report in Behavioral Interventions that we're talking about today, a data-driven algorithmic approach to recommending hours for ABA for individuals with ASD. Definitely want to dive into that. But before we get into the paper, do you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself, how you got into the field, and where that blend of leveraging technology and behavior analysis kind of started for you and came about?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I got started in the field back during my undergrad. I was pre-med, looking to go into psychiatry, trying to find any kind of job. I think I was working retail, so I'd find any kind of job that looks good on the resume for med school. As an undergrad, it's hard to get any job except direct care work. So I happened to just randomly find an ad for hiring. I think it was like an autism habilitator was the name or something like that. We didn't have behavior technicians back then. So signed up. It was ABA for young individuals with autism spectrum disorders and related developmental disabilities. Enjoyed that. Did that about 6 years or about 10 years in total. I was a direct therapist and then like a clinical director. Got my BCBA, had a caseload kind of across that time span. And then toward the end of that kind of clinical work, I started to get really interested in clinical decision making. Mainly, I was a young BCBA in the field. Imposter syndrome is a thing. I started reviewing reports from different BCBAs and started seeing, I don't know, they were making decisions, writing goals that were different than like I would have written. Or I would sometimes see two kids come in, very similar profile, but very different goal recommendations, hours per week. And I just started to get intrigued, like what are the variables leading to different BCBAs making different decisions, including myself. And then kind of back to the ethical piece, how do we know who's right at the end of the day, like doing the best job? So that led me to a PhD in behavior analysis at University of Florida, where I was like, I really want to learn about this choice and decision-making process and how like verbal behavior fits into that. It was there that I also pivoted from working, or I should rephrase that, having like 20, 30 hours a week of data on an individual, like a kid in their program, to I started working into pro health behavior. So diet, physical activity, substance use, with verbally competent adults. And so I went from just like this incredibly rich data set and clinical programs to maybe I get to talk with you 10 minutes a week via the phone. I was like, oh my goodness, how do I get back all the power that comes with those large data sets and understanding what's really going on? And that got me really interested in wearable technologies and things like that. So that's kind of how I started pivoting towards that kind of tech route, seeing how I could use technology to my advantage. And then if you start playing with wearable technologies, those come with these incredibly large data streams that you then have to learn how to handle. So that kind of got me into this big data analytics space. And then right at the same time, a bunch of research started coming out saying artificial intelligence is better than doctors at pretty much everything. Being interested in clinical decision making, I was like, what's this AI thing? And then that was 2015, I think, was when that all kind of coalesced in the middle of my doctoral program. And then since then, the last 10 years has just been trying to blend these three things together and get into whatever crazy things I can. It's been a lot of fun.
That's really cool. I mostly use it to draw like top hats on squirrels, but it's capable of a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Also important things, though. Absolutely.
Right. For sure. That's awesome. So then, let's dive right into the paper then. What was your research question, with this topic? Clinical hour recommendations, for a lot of people can sometimes just feel like a gut call or like instinct, but you propose there being, some data-driven decision-making process with that.
Yeah. So it was interesting. So this was one of the very first things I remember that kind of piqued my interest when I saw people's reports coming in. Different hours being recommended. One would say like 20, another would be like 22. 18 or whatever. It's like, how are they coming up with these numbers? And I just want to know. And similarly, I felt like I was kind of making a gut feel, or, I ask a more senior BCBA and they would say, I don't know, 25. You're like, all right, I guess I'll do for 25. But I always had this like nagging curiosity, like, wait, how are we actually making this choice? And could we reduce the subjectivity and variability across BCBAs using data? I think it makes sense. I don't know. It seemed logical. If I have all
Yeah.
this data based on like past clients that I've worked with, and I know roughly how many hours that person needs, maybe I can just use that same thing. And that's where the original idea came from. And then this idea of like dose response curves and stuff, that popped up really toward the end of my PhD and then my postdoc in behavioral pharmacology, where that's just an incredibly common thing, right? If I'm interested in understanding how some drug influences some, I don't know, disease disorder or whatever, bacteria, colony, whatever, you kind of run the systematic process where I just give an organism different doses of the drug and I see, what effect does that have? And at what point, if I give too much of anything to anybody, it'll kill them. So unfortunately, we, rats and pigeons sometimes in the behavioral pharmacology work, we see how far it goes till you see negative effects. And so, yeah, it was just kind of a blending of those two ideas of, we have all this data rich sets on all these kids we provide or individuals we provided services for. Why don't we think about it from this like dose response curve standpoint and see what happens, just smash some things together and see what pops out.
Yeah. Very cool. And there's a lot of like real world implications for, underestimating and even overestimating clinical hours
Absolutely.
recommendations, right? For something that seems that there's not a lot of, database decision making in it, which doesn't seem very, as a database field, seems like we should have been talking about this for a while now.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think if you look at our literature too, there's this kind of more is always better, more is always better, or whatever. And I think we'll probably get into some of the challenges with that literature generally. But one thing that really struck me when I kind of learned about dose response curves is that they have this curvature to them, right? It's not like just a straight line. More drugs up, you get the same effect. There's reaches an asymptote, it's called. But then I started looking back at some of the historical literature, and they were drawing a line on their data. But when you looked at it, it also started showing this kind of curvature to it. And I was like, oh my goodness, this seems to be everywhere. Kind of back to the point of, and then what's also interesting is it seems like that'll differ for each kid, right? Or individual. Some maybe they learn quickly. I don't know, 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week, we're probably fine. Others, maybe a bit more slowly. Maybe we need that 30, 35, 40. I don't know.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, yeah, dive into it then. How did you go about using it? This was not a single subject design.
Definitely not single subject. Yeah, so at the time I was fortunate. I was working at Rethink. So they're a technology company. They have a variety of services, I guess, that they offer. But the one that I was primarily pulling from was called Rethink BH. So they're a practice management and data collection, or that wing, I should say, is a practice management and data collection platform for ABA clinics. So kind of like Central Reach or other similar products. Enter all my kids' programs in there during session. The RBT can then on my electronic iPad or whatever collect data, and it feeds the system, and then you can visualize it and stuff online. So that's where I was working. So they had this huge database. I think it was like, I should look back at the article. I don't know. I think we had for this close to 40,000 kids. And so we had historically about 8 years worth of data to get all this. Essentially for every kid, we had, how many hours a week of therapy did they actually receive per week across the calendar? I guess all the time in the database. We broke it down to yearly chunks. And then from that, we could also see what was their rate of progress. For this, we used goals mastered, mainly because most kids did not have the same like assessment score or other outcome measures that might be better, more reliable. So we just went with goals mastered because we had it. And then we kind of just simply looked at, we related the
maybe simple for you,
week.
But yeah.
That's right, hours per week to progress made. And kind of took a look. Now, we also added in a ton of other variables, and I think the power of this approach gets into some of the clustering and other things we did in that. But that's really where the data came from. Like, bring it together, plot out for each kid how did hours per week relate to progress made while controlling for these other variables. And when we did it, we got these dose response curves, and it was crazy. I was like, I've been thinking about this for 10 years, and like here it is in front of me. Nuts. Yeah.
It has to be a fun moment.
Oh
Do
yeah.
you want to get into like what some of those variables were that you included? I know there's like demographic information and clinical information, things
Oh
like that.
sure.
What else did you look at?
Yeah. So we had a bunch of different things that spanned. Yeah, I get the demographics the easiest place to start. So we include like things like age. We used for like a proxy of social determinants of health the individual zip code, which allowed us to tie it into this thing called the Area Deprivation Index (ADI).
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
and what that score does, there's a state and a national level one, but it ranks you from a 0 to 100, and then based on your zip code, it's a proxy for social determinants of health. So we had that in there. Um, let's see what else we had. We had a bunch of stuff more like medical background. So we had like allergies, other diagnoses, things like that. I guess we also related demographics, region, like where do they live, in addition to some of
Yeah.
the other stuff. And then we had a ton of information. Oh, medications was another one we had for the medical realm. Then we had a bunch of information on like standardized assessment scores. So again, I was trying to mimic this process that we use, right? I have a bunch of info coming in. At the point in time, I have to make a decision for hours per week. Like, what are those things? So medical, demographic, then a bunch of like assessment information. What are your skill deficits across a variety of domains, communication, social, emotional, play and leisure, things like that. Work primary concerns being reported by the parents and things like that. I think all in all, we had, gosh, for this latest iteration that made it in here, let me scroll up to the abstract really fast, because we played with a number of different things. 48 variables went into this, but really
Okay.
across those kind of three domains: demographics, medical information, which I think was like 10 or 12. And then the bulk was really kind of skill deficit stuff specific to ABA that you might use to make some kind of recommendation.
Gotcha. And this was going back a little bit, compared to previous research, there wasn't a lot of previous research on this exact subject, right? What did
No, yeah.
what do we know from the previous research? What were the limitations there, and how did this differ from what had gone on prior?
Oh, sure. Yeah, great questions. So there have been a handful of people that have looked at how hours per week of ABA relate to progress. Most often goals mastered. I think maybe a few have looked at assessment scores, but primarily goals mastered. Um, Most have taken that kind of linear approach where I'm going to just fit a line to my data, which I think
Mhm.
is one limitation. But by and large, the majority of those analyses have looked at just hours per week, just goals mastered, and then you can kind of see, what does this look like? For me, the biggest challenge with that research, which is also true of the article that we published, is that we lose a ton of information if we don't include a bunch of information about that client, that individual. Everyone comes in with a different learning rate, different skills, different ability to
Mhm.
make progress from the same, dose or hour of ABA. And we handled that a little bit. But the bigger thing, which is not in our article, which is maybe this is future directions we could chat about later. Nobody's talking about what's going on during session. And I suspect if you look at providers across the country, we're all doing it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So when we talk about an hour as like a dose of ABA, I bet my dose looks different than yours, looks different from anyone else's. So I think,
Sure.
anyway, those were some of the big limitations. It was a kind of a very simple analysis, just hours to goals mastered. And then oftentimes they were thinking about it with this kind of linear approach. And so the
Okay.
kind of the two questions here was like, what if we include more information about the client? Could that give us a more tailored prediction? And then two, what if we think about it non-linearly, kind of in the classic way that you see with dose response curves in behavioral pharmacology?
Gotcha. And then you use then what was called a cluster analysis.
Yeah, those are
For
some
us,
cool graphs.
yeah, us non big data folks. Do you
Yeah,
mind kind of giving us like a non-jargony, definition of what that is, and
for sure.
how that made your study distinct from others?
Oh, yes. I'll do my best. Let me know if I need to rephrase any of this. But you can kind of imagine, right? I have 48 different bits of information about a person. Um, and you can maybe think about this kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if this is a good analogy. You have to let me know if it lands. This is my first time trying it live, so it's be curious. Almost like in elementary school, right? Like there's a bunch of kids that show up. The first thing I do is like sort them into grade levels based on
Mhm.
age, probably some kind of school assessment. It's not, age isn't perfect predictor, right? Some kids are smart, we're going to move them up. Some kids maybe need some extra help, we're going to move them back or whatever. And then within each classroom, I'm going to kind of sort kids also by maybe like reading skills or math skills or I don't know, PE, right? Physical skills or whatever. And then based on that, I might kind of tweak tasks or how I teach them or something like that. Cluster analysis is kind of a similar idea where I say, hey, I have all this information on this group of individuals. Let me use that information to put like people together into these kind of smaller groups. Now, there are many ways to do that. And sometimes when you try to say like there's 10 groups in this pocket of individuals and then you graph it, it still kind of looks like two blobs maybe. And you're like, I don't think there's 10 groups here. There's just two. So it's kind of cool that the audience can see in the graphs if they check them out, is that we got all these very distinct groupings of individuals. Yeah. Which one I think is cool by itself. Like that blew me away. But that's kind of the first pass of this is like, if I'm going to try to control for the characteristics of a unique client, let me isolate all the people that are similar to each other and then just look at how hours and other things relate to progress in that group rather than try to fit some like big single model for everybody and say, all individuals should get 10 hours if you're 5 or something, making things up here. But
yeah,
that's kind of the basic idea.
Yeah, it's amazing to look at. What was then kind of the end result? What did you find, and like what practically would this imply? I know there's probably not foolproof yet, but a lot of questions to answer. But what does it imply for the field in general?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about what we found and then kind of how I think about it for the field, I guess.
Sure.
So we did this cluster analysis. We ended up with a bunch of different groups. Within each group, we could then fit a model, a nonlinear model, to look and see how do all these variables relate to progress made, including hours per week. From there, we were able to then essentially, I have this thing that makes these predictions pretty well. Some of the graphs in there trying to show like, look how good we are at making models. Then you can imagine I can just systematically iterate, like, what if I gave you 5 hours? What would we predict? What if I gave you 6 hours? What if I gave you 7, 8, up to 40? And then we could graph the results. And that's where we got those dose response curves in figure 4, which are, again, when I saw those, I was like, oh my gosh, this worked. It's crazy.
Which, sorry to interrupt, but for anybody listening who doesn't have it on, it essentially shows for different patient, correct me if I'm wrong too, different patient profiles, if they meet certain, their variables were a certain profile of a consumer of services, how they could maximize the benefit and at what hours per week that benefit would fall at. So it wasn't necessarily like foolproof, like 40 hours means maximum benefit. For this person, 10 hours would meet maximum benefit, or whatever it might be. Am I close on that?
Oh yeah, no, you nailed it. And we in the graphs, we drew a vertical line where we're like, here's where beyond this, the models were predicting no further progress. So, and kind of your point, each kid was also unique. So like your data, I could run through the model for the cluster, the group of individuals that are most like you, and you would get a very different curve from everybody else. That's kind of what it would look like. Fascinating in and of itself. But I mean, the other kind of interesting thing about some of these is, it's not like this clean, nice curve up to, like, it's kind of jagged and looks a little funky. And for me, that kind of highlights just the complexity of all this, right? Because we have like hours per week plus 47 other things that we're trying to use to make this prediction. And so that's kind of highlighting how all of this stuff interacts to really influence outcomes. So the big takeaway for me is like, I don't think it's as clean as we may have thought historically, where like, I don't know, my gut feel works, or more is always better. There
was one graph I wrote you about, and again, let me know if I'm not interpreting it correctly, but it appeared that, maximum benefit was at like 29 hours a week or something like that. But if you can't do 29 hours and that comes up, the parent can't commit to it or something like that, or the patient can't commit to it. The curve was funny because it showed more benefit at like 10 hours per week than like 15. At 15, it kind of went back down again. Is that it would, in your model, is that something that was like surprising, that different hours based on your clinical profile essentially would mean different things? It wasn't necessarily intuitive.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. And I think to really understand why we saw that one specifically, we probably have to go back and look at the exact model for that individual. And there are things called like SHAP values, ways that you can kind of investigate it. But I
Okay.
think there's a little bit of an intuitive story there. And let's just kind of run with this idea of like 10 versus 15 hours a week, let's say. Um,
Mhm.
15 hours a week, maybe I don't receive therapy on the weekend. So we're talking about like 3 hours a day. That's a little bit different than 10 hours a week, which is like 2 hours a day. Maybe for
Mhm.
the individuals like that in the data set, those 2 hours, therapists were, I don't know, real punchy, right? They're knocking out goals or whatever. 3 hours, people are a little more laid back, right? The kid's there too long. We've burned through everything after like 2 hours, 15 minutes. So they're kind of getting back to this idea that what goes into an hour matters significantly. And then there's also a possibility that hanging out too long in a session is also not productive, because then I just start like repeating trials, or I don't know, the kid starts
Yeah.
to satiate on reinforcers that are in the clinic, or they get annoyed, with that they're hanging out another hour here, same loop of things. Who
Yeah.
knows? um, yeah, that's kind of how I thought about that. This kind of the intuitive nature of, for me, it caused me to rethink some of my own assumptions about, I remember when I
Mhm.
was practicing clinically, on how this all fits together. And I think it's more complex than we maybe currently know or talk about.
Sure. Um, Do you see this working for other clinical applications in the field? Like, for example, I told you before we started, we're primarily in adult services, but our model is very different than most,
Yeah.
clinical ABA, where, at most we're usually given like a weekly visit, sometimes biweekly or monthly. But could the same process apply to that kind of decision making too, or
Oh, sure.
other ventures or other corners of the field essentially?
Yeah, I think so. So, and a few people have reached out, asking like, of this list of 48, like, what are the 20 most important that I should start collecting data on? And usually my
Mhm.
response back is like, I think you're thinking about the paper wrong. Um, I think this what we found here was incredibly interesting, and rethink they turn it into a product that people can interact with if they want. But for me, the bigger takeaway of this was more about the methods. That is,
Mm.
if I have data on individuals that receive service at my clinic, I can start to understand different types of clients I provide services for. Like, that's the whole point of the clustering. Like, let me break these down into smaller groups. And then within each of those groups, the way I provide services or what I do probably matters. So I'm going to do different things for different individuals. And that, I feel like, is more the story of this paper. And that, I think, is generalizable across any clinic. And we can use, you can use AI if you want. You can do very simple things also to just get at
Mhm.
this idea of like cluster clients, think about my decision making and how it differs across those groups. And then from there, just start rigorously using past data to assess the decisions that I make. And that feels like it has broad utility across, I mean, most clinical decisions. But
Sure. Yeah, so we're not at like doing full body scans and then just having a number pop out.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
that'd be
So
cool though. I mean, yeah, if anyone's willing to give me that data, shoot me an email, I guess. But,
the
yeah.
robots aren't winning quite yet, but
No,
no,
yeah, definitely
yeah,
not.
I
very
think it would
cool.
be real interesting with our data from before, during, and after COVID, and dividing it
Right.
by, both mental illness side, developmental disability side, ages, types of target behavior. Would be really cool just to see, using this type of analysis, what kind of patterns we could see. Because anecdotally, we saw increases mostly in those that had community access, and then it was
So
taken away.
interesting. Yeah.
But we haven't been able to really analyze it as well, because again, how do you graph, right? This person's 90, this one's 20, this person,
Mhm.
has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, this one has
Yeah.
nonverbal developmental disability, and how is that really comparable without analysis like that? So that would be very cool.
Oh, that would be awesome. Yeah, no, I love that. COVID offers, I think, so many opportunities for natural experimentation within our data sets to kind of look at that stuff. Related to that, another thing that we found, kind of related to this project, but slightly differently, was we looked at how just trial rate, for example, it's a common other thing that pops up in the literature, like how many learning opportunities you get in an hour, how that relates to progress. And for most kids, we've invariably found this inverse U shape, right? Which similarly is like, too much, right? If I'm just like drilling you for 3 hours, aversive, like reduces the optimal progress. Too few, you're obviously not getting learning trials in. So there's like this interesting optimum somewhere in the middle for most kids, and it differs for each individual also. But kind of going back to like the COVID thing, similar, like a bunch of stuff shifted in session. And if we have data on those things, there's no reason you can't look back and say, I mean, just, it's not a proper experiment, but it's information, right? It's something we can then do something with.
Do you have any concerns with insurance companies or the government trying to say, hey, listen, your optimal gains are going to be made in this area, so that's what we're going to approve, even though you could make some more gains a little bit farther up? I mean, I think as clinicians, this is great, but I do always worry, what's the adverse side of it,
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, I think that's a fair concern. And I think, or how I think about that is in kind of two ways. So the first is that any model is only as good as the variables that I include in it. So I suspect any reader, if they were to go check this out, and at the back end of this in the appendix, we have a list of everything we use. If they were to look at that, they'd say, neat, but you're missing X, you're missing Y, you're missing Z or whatever. And that's incredibly important, because as soon as an insurance company says, hey, this model says 20 hours, you can say, yeah, but it's not including these variables that I know influence rates of progress, which require more hours. Now, in that same breath, the burden is also on us to, if I'm going to make that claim, it'd be nice to come with data to support that claim and whatnot. So there is a risk there, especially if BCBAs are not, they don't have like a basic literacy with modeling generally, or with AI, which I think is just going to be required as we move forward in life with the nature of these things. But the other thing I'd say is I think some of this work also, for me, puts a little bit of onus back on me as a provider too, where I've seen, or I've heard about, I should say, some clinics that are like 25 to thrive, right? Every kid gets X minimum hours. And I think it's a fair question to also ask ourselves, like, do they need that? And if an insurance company too, if they don't really know how to evaluate it, and they similarly, kind of like me back in the day, they're getting reports on kids that look very similar. One says, 70 hours this kid needs, and another says 15. They're wondering what's going on. Like, how do we know who's right or whatever? So, yeah, it's very interesting.
I can definitely see that being helpful, kind of also, because we do hear a lot about unnamed companies saying, nope, 40, everybody gets 40, just maximize what they'll pay everyone. And so if we had a model to say, nope, we're doing this based on this, and now more people or more kids could get help and be served that may not be served otherwise, rather than us maximizing the income from one person, I think that's better for everybody.
Oh, definitely. And I think it inserts some trust back into that relationship too with BCBAs and payers. I don't know. At the end of the day, we should all be here for the kids or the adults, the clients that we serve. And right now, it just feels very combative, right? It's like game theory. Everyone's trying to negotiate and do interesting things. It's like, well, what if we just use data and I don't know, we can each do what we're good at and stop this madness. So.
Unfortunately, I'm a bit of a pessimist, and I'm afraid that relationship's damaged before we even got involved in it. Just from what I see, every time I come into a meeting, it's like, no, you're trying to rip us off, so we're going to argue with you on everything you bring up. I'm like, no, but here's the numbers. Just look. And there's always that distrust before we even get started, it seems like.
Yeah, that's tough. And especially a lot of insurance company, at the end of the day, they're also a financial instrument. So those contingencies are what they are. But yeah.
But this does seem like a really good supplemental tool, once it's fine-tuned and everything, like not to make the decision for us, but a tool to help guide just another variable that we didn't have before to help influence our clinical decision making.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing I think, kind of going back to what I mentioned before, also, one of the big limitations here is this does not control for how people deliver therapy. So I think the real benefit for a tool like this is me as a company, I'm creating my own, where I know a little bit better about how I provide services. I can probably even work some of that data into the modeling or something like that. I think that's where the real power of something like this will come into play. Again, this is neat, and we had a lot of data, but there's some pulls in this too.
Yeah, like if you had like treatment fidelity or like even IOA data to include or something like that.
Oh, that'd be huge.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I love this question. If you had unlimited time, unlimited funding, what would be like your dream next steps with this project?
Oh, sure.
Or
I
and
think-
maybe all of your projects in general too, because you're doing a lot of similar
Oh,
things
interesting.
and
Yeah.
cool
Okay.
stuff. But yeah. What's next
Oh,
for
interesting.
Rich
Oh,
Dr. Cox?
yeah. So let's so maybe I'll take this in kind of two directions. One specifically related to this hours of recommended therapy, clinical decision making generally. I think it would be to start working in more of that information about how therapy is actually delivered, and then also information about staff. Right? If I've been providing ABA for 20 years, an hour of therapy with me is probably going to be a bit different than someone where it's their first day. And if we start understanding the complexity of all those things, then we can just better make predictions and whatnot about what we're doing. So that would kind of be the next step, would be how can we start getting some of that real-time data from sessions to inform these models? And then you can imagine too, there's a scenario where if you spin this towards more kind of everyday decision-making, long-term goal would be a little bug in the ear for like an RBT, right? As they're doing stuff, data's coming in, you can run it through the system and make a recommendation back to them, like, oh, this would be like the optimal next program to run or next target or whatnot.
Cool.
That would be unlimited funds resources.
Right.
The other kind of direction, I've been playing around a lot with artificial organisms lately. And so the idea here is how can we use basic behavioral principles to animate artificial organisms and then like see, do they behave like biological organisms, rats, pigeons, humans? And we can get them to do that. It's kind of crazy. But what's fun about this is you can get them to also imitate the behavior of humans. So we just published one study where I'm a big baseball fan. So we built an artificial organism to learn how to imitate professional pitchers. And then once they were trained on them, they could start predicting the next pitch that they would make. And so what's cool about that, it's like this digital twin idea. What if we did that for the clients we served, right? We started to better understand, what does their behavior and interaction with the environment look like? And can I start making predictions and running simulations around, what if I did X? What if I did Y? What if I introduced this variable? What would happen? I think it would just bring this kind of level of precision behavior analysis, just, I don't know, to a different place. That would be really fun to see where it goes.
Yeah.
Kind of creepy to think about in the long run, but incredibly
I was gonna
exciting.
say, you just introduced the concept of artificial organisms to me like it was nothing, but my mind is kind of blown right now. Do you want to go a little more into that too? I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah. So there's this work kind of falls within a larger branch of science called artificial life. Sounds incredibly exciting. But the whole idea is, can we understand first principles of a system well enough that we can kind of create it from scratch? So here you can imagine like some of this work, people are trying to create like artificial meat in the lab, right? It's not real meat. It's it doesn't taste whatever. This is kind of bending this idea towards behavior science. Can I create these simulations of they're called artificial organisms. Technically, it's just a math, it's a matrix of data, whatever. But can I create this system that step by step in time, it emits behavior, and there are ways we can kind of go about setting that up. That behavior interacts with a larger environment, just like we would see a human, right? Context, reinforcement, punishment, maybe nothing happens. We have larger context around it. And then from that feedback, it learns. So it changes its behavior, does more of some things, less of other things. And then you can imagine this is just all a simulation. So you can run it forward in time, and I can see what are the behavioral patterns that emerge under different environmental contexts and different types of feedback. And then you get these graphs. And a lot of the work, the last, I'd say maybe 10, 20 years has been, how do we create a system and define the rules such that the behavior we get looks like what we actually see with rats and pigeons or humans. The most successful program here is by Jack McDowell and colleagues out of Emory University. It's called Evolutionary Theory of Behavioral Dynamics, ETBD, sometimes referred to as. There's another one, actually, if people are going to be at ABAI in a couple of weeks, I'm talking about Peter Killeen has this thing, Mathematical Principles of Reinforcement. I took that and just kind of turned it into a simulation, and we get similar behavior that looks like we see with rats and pigeons. It's kind of crazy. But that's kind of the basic idea. And then especially with evolutionary theory, behavioral dynamics, the last 3-4 years, Kind of Jack McDowell and colleagues, they showed like, yeah, this approach allows us to generate behavior that looks like rats, pigeons, humans. The last 3-4 years has been a lot of clinicians saying, all right, how do I actually use this in like a clinical capacity? Can I better identify, interventions for self-injurious behavior? So like John Michael Falligant, Louis Hagopian, they've done some work around this, Sam Morris. And that's where it's kind of just starting to spin now, is turning that into some kind of practical applied use case.
Wow.
Yeah,
So-
it's crazy. It's nuts to think about.
Yeah.
With that, are they starting kind of with the mathematics and then building there and letting the machine learn, or are they building with kind of data collected and then letting?
Oh yeah, great question.
From there.
Yeah. So the artificial organisms that I'm talking about with evolutionary theory, behavioral dynamics, and then what I did with mathematical principles of reinforcement, those are starting scratch, right? So in the ETBD sense, they start with 1,000 responses in a repertoire. And then certain of those would be like a response class. And then from that just evolves, and you kind of see, things pop up. With mathematical principles of reinforcement, similar idea. I define a kind of constrained response set, and then I just hit go and let it run and like see what happens. The pitching one, where we learn to predict the next pitch. Those artificial organisms did start with the human data set. So here I had data on all those pitchers, and I essentially said, like, just hang out and watch the first couple of years of their career to see what they do. And what I should rephrase that, here's the set of behaviors they can watch, but each make a prediction, and then I'm going to give you feedback. Are you right or wrong, essentially? And by and large, what we found was after about, I think it was 2 seasons, 2.5 seasons on average. Once it had watched for that number of responses, which is non-trivial, that's still a large amount. Then it started to make decent predictions, and we could get up over 90% accuracy predicting the next pitch. So there's kind of multiple ways you could go about it. And I think it's the like data set. Maybe I'll rephrase this also. For that data set with the baseball players, I used a very particular algorithm from artificial intelligence. Kind of has relation to behavioral principles, but not really. So where I think the like really interesting happy medium space for me, which would kind of be the next step, would be, have all this data on humans. What if I use some of these theories that are more behaviorally informed, like Jack McDowell's or Killeen's mathematical principles, and kind of blend the two of these ideas together. And see what happens.
The reason I asked is I've talked to colleagues about this before and had some ideas after seeing a few of the early AI presentations, which probably 10 years ago now, but doesn't seem that long ago. That, my process, I'd actually worked with a mathematician on this for a while. He's a professor of theoretical algebra, and it was a little bit of our ability to communicate with one another in each other's science kind of was a bit of a barrier there. But I always thought a model of how the variables interact, such as, motivating operations, discriminative stimuli, history of punishment and reinforcement, trying to design the mathematical model to teach ahead of time and then use that with the data collection on individual organisms. And so it sounds like maybe some have tried that, but it's almost coming from the opposite direction, and it's going to meet in the middle at some point, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. There was a guy, I'm trying to remember, Bill Hutchison, I think is his name. I can confirm that. Tried to do kind of like what you were talking about, where, we have all these mathematical models from behavior analysis that have been developed. Can I put those into a single system and get it to work? I believe he was somewhat successful. The one interesting kind of challenge there is a lot of those models are built on heavily controlled lab settings where it's, two responses, one light. Clinical setting is thousands of responses. Who knows the dynamics of the environmental stimuli. But like getting that mapping, I think, is a little bit tricky. So kind of to your point, I think the optimal route will probably be a blend, and comes from some of the new technologies where we can get more data on behavior, get more data on environmental stimuli. And then bring those into what we kind of know from basic research and build a system.
working with the mathematician was really interesting because it was very much like, all right, here is the effects of motivating operations. It's almost never zero. Like you are fully satiated, not hungry at all, smell a French fry, and now the MO may occur. So latently it's always there, but maybe at very low levels. It's never zero. So he's like, all right, seems like that should be almost treated as an exponent because it's there. It may be so minimal that it's not controlling your behavior at the time, but also can be so large that it controls large amounts of behavior. And so that was kind of the approach we were taking. It's like, all right, mathematically, how does this match up based on its effect on behavior?
I love it.
And then we stalled out a little bit there at the end after he had a kid, but that's
that
how things go.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, if you all pick that work back up, I'd be incredibly interested to chat more about it.
If you wanted some time, I'd show you what we come up with so far and to see what you think. That'd be fun.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to change topics completely. Go ahead, Kyle.
No, do it. I was gonna make a dumb joke, so.
Oh, I like dumb jokes.
We could probably use a dumb joke right about now.
Oh, I just my brain goes back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy: Secret of Life being the number, was it 42? That's what I keep coming up with during this. So I don't know how helpful I am to this conversation, but I did have that to contribute.
No, incredibly helpful. I actually insert that joke into some of my presentations where it's like we do all this math or whatever, and like the answer is change slides, and it's just like 42.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I love it.
I'm very proud of my parenting. My boys are very, very fluent in the whale falling from space scene in the movie and in the book. They love that part. So
that's awesome.
Anyways, go ahead, Steve.
Nice.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm also a little bit unprepared. I was coming from a bit of a family emergency here, so I apologize. I don't remember who it was that did it, but there's a presentation. I'm thinking it was Chicago, ABAI, a couple Chicagos ago. And their presentation was a lot on basically theoretically, if we're going to use AI, we need to teach computers and machines to use reinforcement rather than punishment to save our species, our planet, because so much of our culture is based on punishment. It could become, your average dystopian novel, basically, if we don't teach it based on reinforcement instead. Have you thought, read, or just interesting anecdotes about that sort of thing? I don't know. It just seemed like something to throw in.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, I think there's kind of two reactions to that, I guess. The first is that if you look at a lot of the large language models in particular, they work based on, I guess, kind of like we were talking about before, the data that you feed into it. So to the extent that the text data that we have, or when we interact with the system online and we're giving feedback or whatever, thumbs up, thumbs down, to the extent that we push aversive control into that, we're going to see more of that out. So I think that is something to be definitely concerned or to be cognizant of as we interact with these systems. I don't know. You probably can tell, I'm an optimist. I get excited about a lot of things. I'm incredibly positive when I interact with ChatGPT and these things. I only get nice things back. So I'm, maybe doing my part. Who knows what humanity's doing? The interesting thing, though, and this is my second reaction, goes back to that study where we were trying to build these AOs to imitate and then predict the next behavior these professional pitchers were making. If we didn't introduce a loss parameter punishment, it's a computer system, so I'm still figuring out, is it punishment? I don't know, whatever. If we didn't introduce punishment, we could only get about 55% accurate responding. So that was, I think for me, interesting. And we ran this there was another study presented at ABAI with these spider robots where I was trying to get them to do mazes. Same thing we found there. Without some kind of loss or punishment, performance was horrible. Now, I'll quickly kind of hop in there and say, I don't know if, one, we know punishment is a basic phenomena generally. So I think it reminded me oh, right, this is a thing. The other thing, though, about a lot of these systems, and this is where the jargon thing comes in, every time I emit a response, there is technically a cost to it, right? It takes energy to emit it. So that's the other thing is was my feedback really punishment? Was it actually working in this cost aspect to behavior that already exists that we just don't really talk about? And I could add punishment on top of that differently. I don't know. I think a lot of really interesting questions to think about and ask, but
especially
it's coming.
With with our verbal behavior, I don't think there's anything that we do that's reinforcing that doesn't have some sort of concurrent punishing contingency involved too. I mean, you eat something and you're immediately thinking like, oh, what's this going to do to my health? You know what I mean? And so, there's always
I have
something
that
like
struggle with ice cream every night. Yeah.
I just wonder, because so many models that we see just, out there in society nowadays seem to be taking all the behavior data, everything people are searching, saying, and doing. It concerns me because of some of the behavior we see in society. And then plus, all the Facebook posts like, oh, we taught this AI system how to be a sociopath, or how to become a serial killer.
Like, why are you doing this?
Are you putting that out there for the other learning systems to then contact that material is even more potentially concerning. I don't know. It's all very interesting to me, but I think I do have a general lack of understanding on how these models kind of work in general. You understand this is taking all this data and then compiling it and comprising it into behavior or computerized behavior, but are there constraints in there to try to stop that sort of thing as well?
Yeah, supposedly there are. I think I'd use this moment also to revisit something with the algorithm paper, where I think the true utility of AI in the long run is us learning how to build our own for our own businesses. So large models incredibly powerful because they got there first. They have a lot of money, but we know from like a resource standpoint, it's not sustainable. Like we can't. I think we're up to now 2% or 4% of total global electricity consumption is just for data centers for these things. It's estimated to get to like 20% in the next 10 years with our current pace. Like that's crazy. Wow. So I think the power is, for me, for my company, if I need an AI or want an AI to do something, or me as a human, the ability to create these is becoming so much more accessible, and we have so much more data. How can we learn to build our own that has those guardrails in place and like does the thing that I want it to do, how I want it to do it? And I'm not kind of reliant on these big tech companies and whatever they're pushing.
I was going to ask, in your paper, you mentioned how this big data analytics, AI, all that stuff isn't necessarily in the skill set of most BCBAs. It's not in our education. What like ethical responsibilities do you think we have just as things move so rapidly in that direction? What do you think we should be learning and applying?
Oh, that's a great question. So coincidentally, I just had an article accepted, Perspectives on Behavior Science, on this topic exactly, like what is ethical ABA in the age of AI?
Well, we should have you back for that one then too.
Yeah, I'd love to chat about it. Within that, maybe I'll kind of give the high level version. Within that, I kind of outlined different levels, I think. But maybe I'll take a step back. It seems like moving forward as a human to behave ethically in any industry, you have to be AI literate. It's just here. And so it's good to know how to use tools safely and effectively. What that means, I think, probably depends on the level or your position within maybe a company or how you would use it. So I think we can think about like that base level, and this would be someone, maybe RBT, I just graduated with my master's degree, entering the field. You probably need to know what tools exist, what they're good for, and then how to really evaluate the output to know, is this BS I'm getting, or do I need to think twice about it? If I'm kind of moving up maybe into like leadership positions, probably need to know a little bit more about how these systems are built, or at least how to ask the right questions to understand what are the biases that the marketers and salespeople are not telling me, what are the limitations, do I actually even need this thing, that kind of stuff. And then I think there's another level, and I think I end up with 5 or 7 in the paper, but another level would be kind of going off the deep end where it's like, I want to do this for my career. In that scenario, you're probably going to have to get in, learn math, coding, a lot of the data skills, that kind of stuff. So I think like what AI literacy means depends on like what you do, your level in the field, roles you carry and things like that, because you may just make different decisions or use AI in different ways. But minimally, I mean, I think at the end of the day, base level skill, we all, I think, need to know how to, if I have a use case for AI, how can I actually sample available tools and then know which one is actually appropriate for my task at hand and evaluate that output? Seems like critical moving forward. I don't know, but maybe not.
No.
Maybe someone will prove me wrong. Yeah.
I like it.
Nice.
I want to be mindful of your time too. We're nearing
Oh,
our
appreciate
hour.
it.
Are there any other questions or comments from the audience, or David? Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you feel remiss not to say?
Sure. I have a question for you all, but I'll pause in case anybody wanted to ask
Yeah.
questions. I don't want to anybody else.
Cool. Go ahead. I think it's you.
So yeah, nice. So I think one thing that I'm curious about, so we built this primarily prototypical ABA use case, right? If you look at the data set at Rethink, most individuals 2 to about 8 in that data set.
Mhm.
There were some that got into the teens. What I'd be kind of curious, kind of reflecting back on the types of services that you all provide, is when you think about this idea of like identifying groups of clients or patients influencing clinical decision making, like what are those top few critical decisions that you're like, oh, I would love to have something to support these kinds of decisions?
This seems like a good one for Steve to weigh in on too. I'll ponder it while you talk, because I know this is something that you probably already got up in your head.
I mean, there's a lot of different things, and the parts that I find the hardest, I think, to teach are going in and observing in the moment. You know, if we can see behavior, are you picking up on the nuance? Like, all right, this behavior is only happening because this other consumer is in the corner making faces at him behind your back. You don't see it, or whenever the caregiver's demeanor changes, that's when we see instances of target behaviors, and kind of teaching those moments to key in on some of those aspects. It's hard to teach if you're not there and just monitoring and giving that feedback. A lot of it is just planning and developing too. Everybody kind of knows you use differential reinforcement, but something very underused, I think, in our area of the field is, changing magnitudes of reinforcement. So you don't have, the extinction burst that you would have normally, or you can effectively change behavior without it being so salient that the person knows, okay, this behavior plan's in place right now. And we would need more data, but anecdotally, I feel that behavior plans are more effective when they're not super salient like that. And it's very obvious to the person, okay, you've changed the environment, and now when you're gone, now it's back to the way it was,
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, those are both really good things.
I thought of too. I love talking about restrictions, and how in our line we have to make that decision of if a restriction is clinically appropriate or not, and that would be the temporary reduction of somebody's rights for their safety, for the safety of others, things like that. So community supervision. Should this person be able to go in the community by themselves unsupervised, or would that create a safety risk for them or for other people? And a lot of times that is kind of like that gut call, that we talked about at first, is like, well, there's a history of it. It's been 5 years, but 5 years ago it was really severe, so severe that their life was in danger or something like that. Having some sort of data set to as another variable in your decision making, so you can feel assured about your decision, because it's a big decision, whether somebody has the ability to do these things or not. But I don't know. Yeah, that's just another one that came to my head.
That's great. And you can't really run an experiment on that. No one in the lab is going to do that study.
Nope, not ethically.
Our situation for the majority of our consumers, I think we're probably around 400 consumers right now that we serve with severe behavior issues. Most of those, though, are kind of train the trainer type situations. We're only given an hour or two a week using a technician to work with staff, because the community mental health agencies or insurance or what have you won't pay for the BCBA to be the one in there doing the work all the time. And so we have one contract that does that, but our data may not even easily match up with some of this, at least in terms of our staff behavior, because now we're talking about 2 or 3 steps removed, and we're actually intervening on the behavior of the primary caregiver to use the plan, not on the consumer themselves.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, it's a lot of, for me, when I hear these things too, I just think we have jobs trying to solve a lot of really hard problems for a while.
I always tell when I'm giving the pitch, for a new contract, I'm like, we have a lot of barriers, and we're surprisingly effective with all these barriers. And so I can show you that data, but there are going to be cases where there's just too many things in the way because there's so much of our control.
Yeah. So
Well, cool. It's been really great having you here. This has been
Oh,
Dr.
thanks.
David Cox, author of the new in behavioral interventions right now, a data-driven algorithmic approach to recommending hours of ABA for individuals with ASD. Thanks so much for being on Cooperant Learning Podcast. We appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Appreciate you all having me on here. It's a fantastic conversation.